The first time I found the red spray paint on my garage door, I thought some punk kids had gotten bored. I live in a quiet neighborhood outside of Denver. Nice homes, trimmed lawns, and unfortunately, an HOA with way too much time on their hands. I scrubbed the paint off that morning before work, cursing under my breath and figuring that was the end of it. It wasn't. The second time, for nights later, the words non-compliant eyesore were scrawled across my garage in huge, dripping letters. This time, I didn't clean it. I stood there at 5 in the morning, arms crossed, staring at the mess while the sun threatened to rise behind me. My name is Trent Ralston, and I don't scare easy. I've worked construction for 22 years. I've been through worse than some coward with a can of Rust-Oleum. But I'd had enough. I knew exactly who was behind it too. Florence Ellerby, our HOA president. She was the type of woman who wielded her clipboard like a weapon and spoke in that nasal, passive-aggressive tone that made you want to punch drywall. Blonde bob, oversized sunglasses, and a voice that sounded like she permanently had something sour in her mouth. Florence had it out for me ever since I refused to paint my garage desert sand, like the rest of the neighborhood. Mine was dark slate gray, not neon green, not polka-dotted, just not beige. And for Florence, that was sacrilege. "You're ruining the uniformity of the community, Mr. Ralston," she'd said one afternoon as I was working on my truck. "That color violates the approved palette outlined in the charter. It's paint, Florence, not a gang sign." Florence didn't like backtalk. She especially didn't like being challenged. Over the next few weeks, I got a barrage of petty violation notices. My trash bins were out too early. My grass was 1 inch over regulation. My Christmas lights were too bright for the season. It was summer, but vandalizing my property? That was a whole new level of crazy. I walked straight into the house and told my wife Fiona. She was standing at the kitchen counter, pouring coffee into her travel mug before her shift at the hospital. She worked nights in the ER and didn't have the patience for HOA drama. "She did what?" Fiona's eyes flared. "That woman's lost her damn mind." "I'm done playing nice," I said. "She wants a war? She's got one." That day, I installed 2 motion-activated cameras, one on the garage pointing toward the street, and one tucked under the eaves of the house angled at the driveway. I didn't bother filing a police report yet. I wanted proof. Real, undeniable footage of Florence Ellerby committing a crime. And I didn't have to wait long. 3 nights later, the cameras caught her. It was just past 2 in the morning. The footage showed a silver Lexus creeping down the street without headlights, then stopping in front of my driveway. Florence stepped out, hoodie pulled over her head like she was in a low-budget heist movie. She crept up to my garage door, pulled a can of spray paint from her purse, and went to work like this was her personal art project. She wrote "trashy" across the panel in big block letters. I watched the footage 3 times before Fiona came into the room the next morning. "You got her?" she asked, half asleep, rubbing her eyes. "Oh, I got her." I spent the rest of the morning downloading the footage, taking screenshots, and printing everything out. I even captured the license plate. Florence wasn't exactly subtle. Her car was registered to the HOA. That's right, the same HOA that paid for its board members to drive around in company vehicles. They claimed it was for community inspections. I called it a mobile harassment unit. By noon, I was at the police station. The officer at the front desk was a younger guy named Officer Mullins. When I told him what happened, he raised an eyebrow. When I showed him the footage, his whole demeanor changed. "That's your HOA president?" "Sure is," I said. "And that's her spray painting my garage." He leaned in, replayed the video, then nodded. "You want to press charges?" "Absolutely." He had me fill out a report, then took the footage and photos into the back. 30 minutes later, he came back with a grin. "We're gonna have a word with Ms. Ellerby. You'll hear from us soon." That night, I parked my lawn chair at the end of the driveway with a cold beer in hand and waited. Sure enough, Florence came marching down the sidewalk around dusk, her ever-present clipboard tucked under her arm. She stopped dead when she saw me. "What exactly do you think you're doing, Mr. Ralston?" she hissed. "Enjoying the evening," I said, taking a sip. "You see the garage? I left your masterpiece up. Thought the neighbors might want to admire it." Her face shifted tight, twitchy. She glanced at the camera above the garage and then back at me. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" I tipped my beer toward the house. "Cops already saw the footage." "I'd be careful walking around at night." Florence went pale. For the first time since I'd known her, she didn't have a comeback. She turned on her heel and stormed off down the street. The next morning, 2 squad cars pulled into the neighborhood. And I wasn't the only one watching. The squad cars parked with deliberate slowness, tires crunching over the gravel shoulder as the engines idled in front of Florence's house. 2 officers stepped out, one of them Officer Mullins from yesterday, the other a tall woman with mirrored sunglasses and a clipboard, not the petty kind Florence wielded, but the kind that came with actual legal weight. From my garage, I watched as they knocked on her door. No answer. They knocked again, louder. After another minute, the storm door creaked open and there she was, wrapped in a silk robe, eyes darting behind them toward the neighbors already peeking through curtains. Florence didn't step outside. The female officer did the talking, calm but firm. I couldn't hear what was said, but the gestures told the story, pointing at the Lexus, flipping through the clipboard, showing her something on a tablet. Florence's face went rigid. She tried to close the door, but Officer Mullins blocked it with his boot and leaned in slightly. That got her attention. Fiona came outside just in time to see Florence step out of her house, arms crossed tightly over her chest like she was trying to fold herself into a paper crane. The officers escorted her to the squad car without cuffs yet. But the fact that she was being led away at all? That was enough to send a ripple through the neighborhood. I didn't cheer. I didn't wave. I let the sirens speak for me as the car pulled away and half the street stood frozen in their driveways, watching the queen of compliance disappear behind tinted glass. That evening, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Ralston," said the voice on the line. "This is Detective Harlan with the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your HOA's finances." I blinked, caught off guard. "Finances?" "Yes, sir," he said. "We've opened an investigation into possible misuse of funds and misconduct by the HOA board. Your footage opened the door. Now we're looking deeper." I agreed to meet him the next morning. Detective Harlan was the kind of man who moved with quiet purpose. No unnecessary words, no wasted movements. He met me at the local precinct, a thick file already in hand. He didn't open with small talk. "We found something," he said, laying out a series of printed emails, expense reports, and internal memos. "Turns out your HOA's budget has more holes than a leaky roof." I leaned in, reading the headers. Landscaping invoices, security patrol contracts, monthly vehicle maintenance logs for the HOA's Lexus. All of them signed off by Florence. All of them suspiciously inflated. "That security company here," Harlan said, tapping one form, "doesn't exist. Neither does the landscaping crew they claim to use. And those vehicle repairs? They've been billing the HOA for tire replacements every month for a car that barely leaves the neighborhood." I stared at the page. "She's been embezzling." "Looks that way," he said. "We're issuing subpoenas for the rest of the board's communications and bank records. We'll let the forensic accountants piece it together, but I can already tell you this isn't small potatoes. There's at least 75 grand unaccounted for over the last 2 years. So what happens now?" I asked. "We keep digging. If this pans out, we're looking at felony charges, fraud, conspiracy, possibly even money laundering if any of these shell companies were set up to filter the funds." I walked out of the precinct with my head spinning. What started with graffiti had cracked open something much bigger. Over the next week, things in the neighborhood changed fast. With Florence in custody, the remaining board members scrambled to hold an emergency meeting. They sent out a flyer printed, not emailed, inviting homeowners to the clubhouse for a community update. No mention of Florence. No mention of the police. I went anyway. The clubhouse was packed. People stood along the walls, arms folded, waiting for answers. At the front of the room was a folding table where 3 remaining board members sat looking like kids called to the principal's office. The head of this makeshift trio was a man named Curtis Bell, the treasurer. He wore a navy sweater vest and had the permanent expression of someone bracing for a sneeze. "We'd like to thank you all for coming," he said, voice thin and uneven. "As you may have heard, there have been recent developments regarding Mrs. Ellerby's conduct as HOA president." "You mean her arrest?" someone near the back called out. Curtis winced. "Yes. That?" He cleared his throat. "We are cooperating fully with law enforcement and have begun a review of all financial activity under her tenure. In the meantime, we're appointing an interim president and will be calling for a full re-election in 30 days. A woman raised her hand. "Are we going to get a breakdown of where the money went?" "That's part of the audit. We'll be transparent with all findings as soon as I interrupted him. "Why weren't you transparent before?" The room fell quiet. Curtis adjusted his glasses. "Excuse me. You signed off on the financials, didn't you? You approved the landscaping budget, the vehicle maintenance, those fake security invoices. Are you saying you didn't notice anything strange?" I trusted Florence to handle vendor selection. You're the treasurer. It's your job to verify every expense. So either you were asleep at the wheel or you were in on it." Murmurs rippled through the room. A man near the front crossed his arms. "I want to see receipts." Curtis looked like he wanted the floor to open beneath him. "We'll release everything once the audit is complete," he said quickly. "I assure you, we're taking this seriously." I didn't press further. I didn't need to. The neighborhood had woken up. Over the next few days, the clubhouse became a hub of activity. Volunteers organized a petition to suspend the current board until new elections could be held. Fiona, on her one day off, helped draft the language for the petition to comply with our neighborhood's bylaws, something Florence had always used to her advantage but now worked against her cronies. By the end of the week, over 70% of residents had signed it. With that, the board was forced to dissolve pending a full vote. Curtis, red-faced and humiliated, resigned before he could be pushed out. Meanwhile, Detective Harlan kept me updated. They traced the vendor payments to a personal account in Florence's maiden name. The shell companies were created using burner phones and email addresses registered at the local library. She hadn't even tried to hide it well. Classic case of getting cocky. The real cherry on top? They found more surveillance footage, not mine, but from a neighbor across the street, showing Florence's Lexus parked outside another resident's home a few weeks earlier. That resident, an elderly woman named Miriam, had received 3 fines for improper fence height, despite her fence being unchanged in 20 years. Florence had snuck onto her property and loosened the top rail herself, just enough to make it tilt. Evidence of tampering. Harassment. Add that to the vandalism and fraud, and Florence was looking at a long list of charges. Still, it wasn't about revenge for me. It was about setting things right. In the weeks that followed, our neighborhood underwent more change than it had in the past 5 years. For the first time, board meetings were open to all residents. Budgets were posted online. Fines required photographic evidence and a second signature. And the new president? A retired city planner named Rosa Winsmart, fair and allergic to nonsense. One evening, as Fiona and I sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the rooftops, she leaned over and said, "You know, you could have just painted the garage beige." "Yeah," I said, "but then Florence would still be running this place." She raised her cup of tea. "To dark slate gray." I clinked my beer against it. "To justice with a clear coat finish." 2 weeks after Florence's arrest and the board's collapse, the neighborhood felt like it had been scrubbed clean for the first time in years. People were out more on porches, in driveways, talking to each other rather than retreating behind blinds. Even the usual tension that hovered around HOA meetings had vanished. But the aftermath was far from over. Detective Harlan called again. This time it wasn't about Florence. It was about what they'd found on her laptop. "I need you to come in, Mr. Ralston," he said. "We've uncovered something significant." I met him at the precinct, same office, different energy. The file on his desk was twice as thick as last time, the tabs color-coded like a legal rainbow. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Florence wasn't just inflating invoices and pocketing the difference," Harlan said, flipping open the file. "She was fabricating property violations to justify liens on homes." I leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "She and a few others on the board were filing false citations. Trash violations, fence codes, even architectural noncompliance. Then they'd claim the fines weren't paid and file liens through a third-party collections firm they registered in Nevada. The firm was nothing more than a shell, but it was enough to make the liens look real." He pulled out a copy of a document with a seal and signature. It looked official. Too official. I looked at the name on it. "This says my neighbor Arlo had a lien filed against him?" Harlan nodded. "He's one of 17. Most of them are older residents, a few single parents. People less likely to fight back or question the paperwork." My chest tightened. Arlo was a retired machinist who spent most afternoons feeding birds on his back patio. He wasn't someone who'd ever go to court. He probably thought the whole thing was real. Were they collecting payment? They were. Bank transfers, checks, even cash drop-offs. Over $85,000 in total. I took a breath. So Florence and her crew were running a fake collections racket through the HOA. Exactly. And now we're building a case for wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. I sat in silence for a moment, absorbing it all. I had been angry when she spray-painted my garage. But this was something darker. This wasn't just about petty power games or control. This was targeted exploitation. "When are you going public?" I asked. "Soon. Once we finish interviewing the residents and confirming who paid what. We're freezing assets tied to the fake collections firm now. But we're going to need someone to help us organize a list of affected homes. Someone the community trusts." That night, I sat in my garage with Fiona, the laptop open between us as we scrolled through documents Harlan had sent over names, addresses, dates of alleged violations. 17 households, just like he said. Some of them I knew well. Others I'd only waved at in passing. "This goes back over a year," Fiona said, her brow furrowed. "Look at this one Mrs. Cardenas. They fined her for non-permitted front porch decor after her husband passed. She told me she couldn't afford to fix her roof last fall." I muttered. "She probably thought she had to pay the lien first." Fiona shook her head. "They went after people when they were vulnerable. We spent the next few days knocking on doors. Mrs. Cardenas was first. She opened the door slowly, clutching a shawl around her shoulders even though it was warm out. When I explained what we'd found, she stared at me for a long moment before her voice finally cracked through. "I thought it was real. They sent a letter with a seal. Said I'd lose the house if I didn't pay." "You're not alone," I said. "We're getting everyone together. The police are building a case." Her hands trembled as she nodded. "I paid nearly $4,000. I used the money my daughter sent for groceries. I promise," Fiona said gently, "they're not going to get away with it." We visited the rest of the 17. Some were furious, some were stunned into silence. Most had never questioned the charges. The HOA's seal, the legal tone of the letters, it had all looked legitimate. But once we gathered the stories, the pattern was undeniable. Fiona contacted a friend at a local legal aid group, and within a week, we had a pro bono attorney volunteering to represent the victims in civil court. Her name was Dana Meeks, and she was fire in a three-piece suit. She brought in a paralegal, a notary, and a portable scanner, and we turned the clubhouse into a makeshift legal clinic. One by one, residents came in to give statements, sign affidavits, and start the process of recovering what they'd lost. Meanwhile, Detective Harlan was preparing for indictments. "They're going to unseal the charges tomorrow morning," he told me over the phone. "We've got Florence, Curtis, and 2 others on the board dead to rights. Wire fraud, falsifying legal documents, conspiracy to commit racketeering. This isn't small claims anymore. This is federal. The next morning, federal agents arrived in unmarked vehicles. No sirens this time. Just quiet, efficient arrests. Florence had posted bail from her vandalism charge, but now she was being taken in on a whole new set of charges with no chance of walking out anytime soon. Curtis was picked up at his office downtown, where he worked as an accountant. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The news hit the local stations by noon. HOA fraud scheme busted in Jefferson County. They even showed a clip of our neighborhood sign, with the camera panning across the tree-lined street that looked so peaceful on the surface. But the real moment of justice came during the town hall meeting that night. Every chair was filled. Some people stood in the back, hands in pockets, others held printouts of the fraudulent documents we'd uncovered. Dana stood at the front with a whiteboard outlining how restitution would work, while Rosa, our new interim HOA president, laid out plans for a complete structural overhaul. She cleared her throat and looked over the crowd. From this point forward, no fines will be issued without third-party verification and photographic evidence. All financial records will be posted online every quarter. And all board members will be vetted through a background check before appointments. Dana stepped up next. And for those of you who were victimized by the false liens, criminal charges are being pursued against the perpetrators. And we are filing a class action civil suit to recover the stolen funds. If you haven't signed on yet, we'll have forms at the back table. A man near the front raised his hand. How do we make sure this never happens again? Rosa didn't hesitate. We make the board accountable to the people. No more closed-door decisions, no more rubber-stamped fines. We rotate leadership, we audit ourselves, and we vote. The room erupted in applause. Later that night, as I walked home, the air felt different. Lighter somehow. Not because everything was fixed, there was still work to do, but because people had stood up together. Not just against Florence, but against the system that let her get that far. Fiona met me on the porch, her face tired but content. Didn't think a can of spray paint would lead to a federal indictment, she said. I sat beside her. Not exactly the outcome I expected either. But worth it, I nodded. Every second, we sat in silence listening to the crickets. A few houses down, someone was stringing up patio lights. Across the street, a group of kids were chalking the sidewalk with bright colors and cartoon suns. The neighborhood at last was ours again. The new HOA elections came and went with an energy that felt more like a liberation rally than a neighborhood formality. By the time June rolled around, Rosa Wynn had been officially elected by a landslide, and the rest of the board was filled with people who had no interest in clipboards or power trips, just neighbors looking out for each other. No one wore matching polos anymore. The Lexus was gone. The community bulletin board had replaced its old printed threats with flyers for potlucks, garage sales, and a Saturday morning walking club. But before we could fully put the Florence era behind us, there was still something lingering, something that didn't sit right. I was in my garage one evening working on Fiona's old Jeep, wiring in a new winch she'd wanted for years, when Harlan pulled up unannounced. He stepped out wearing a different expression than usual. Less investigative, more troubled. Got a minute? He asked, glancing toward the open garage. Sure, I said, wiping my hands on a rag. What's going on? He leaned against the hood of the Jeep, arms crossed. Remember the shell company Florence used to file those fake liens? Yeah. The one registered in Nevada. Well, he said, lowering his voice slightly, turns out it wasn't just used for liens. We traced payments from that same company to a private investigator in Pueblo. Cash transfers. 17 in total. I felt my jaw tighten. A pie? Why would Florence need? She was having residents followed. Not all of them. Just the ones who contested fines or asked too many questions during board meetings. She had them surveilled. Took photos. Logged their schedules. I've got the files. I let out a slow breath. That's not just fraud. That's stalking. He nodded. We're treating it as criminal harassment. Some of the residents were photographed in their backyards, in grocery store parking lots, even picking their kids up from school. Florence paid the PI through the shell company to keep it off the HOA's books. Does anyone else on the board know? We think Curtis knew. There's an email chain between him and the PI. He was forwarding addresses and asking for disciplinary leverage. That's the phrase he used. I shook my head. So if someone stood up at a meeting and asked where the money was going, they got followed around and photographed from a distance? Exactly. We've already contacted the victims. Some were understandably shaken. He paused, then added, "You were on the list too." I didn't say anything. Just felt the weight of it settle in my chest. The idea that someone had been watching me, documenting where I went, who I talked to, how I spent my afternoons, it made the vandalism feel like a warm-up act. Why now? I asked finally. Why tell me this now? Because the DA's office is preparing to add felony stalking and conspiracy charges to the case. They want testimony, and they want the community to know how deep this went. The next morning, I met with the assistant district attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Leanne Grant. She laid out the full scope of the operation in a quiet conference room surrounded by case files. We have enough to indict Florence and Curtis on over a dozen counts each, she said, sliding a manila folder toward me. But we'd like you to go on record about the events leading up to the vandalism, the notices, the pattern of escalating fines, the surveillance. It establishes motive and shows how far they were willing to go. I flipped through the folder. Inside were photos taken from a telephoto lens, me at the hardware store, me working on my truck, me talking to Fiona on the porch. None of them threatening, just invasive, cold. I'll testify, I said. The grand jury convened in early July. I wasn't the only one called. Arlo, Mrs. Cardenas, Dana from Legal Aid, all of us gave detailed accounts. The prosecution presented the emails, the financial records, the surveillance logs. The PI had already turned state's evidence in exchange for immunity. He claimed he was hired under the impression it was for insurance purposes, but the emails made it clear what Florence and Curtis really wanted. The jury didn't take long. Florence was charged with felony vandalism, wire fraud, criminal harassment, conspiracy to commit racketeering, and unlawful surveillance. Curtis got hit with similar charges, plus obstruction for deleting emails once the investigation began. Both were denied bail this time. The trial date was set for late fall. In the meantime, the neighborhood kept moving forward. With Rose's leadership, we introduced something brand new. The Community Oversight Committee. It wasn't just a watchdog group, it had actual oversight authority, with power to audit the board, review complaints, and even freeze spending if something smelled off. Fiona joined the committee. So did Arlo. So did Mrs. Cardenas. We went from victims to sentinels. One evening, I was replacing a ceiling fan in the clubhouse when Rosa stopped by. She carried a slim laminated binder and a look of quiet determination. "We're renaming the HOA," she said. I raised an eyebrow. Didn't know that was an option. "Apparently, neither did Florence," she replied. "But it is. Turns out the bylaws were written in '97 under the original developer. No one's changed them since. We're going to vote on it next month." "What's the new name?" She opened the binder and flipped to the front page. Silver Ridge Neighborhood Association. No more executive council. No more corporate titles. Just neighbors. I nodded. Good. Feels right. When the trial finally arrived, it was held in a packed courtroom in downtown Denver. Press lined the steps. Local reporters called the case one of the most elaborate HOA corruption scandals in state history. But inside, the tone was somber. No theatrics. Just facts, files, and testimony. Florence showed no emotion as the evidence was presented. Curtis kept his head down most of the time. The jury heard about the fake fines, the liens, the private investigator, and the vandalism. They saw the footage from my security camera. They heard the recordings Florence left on her HOA voicemails, the ones Dana had subpoenaed, where she talked about crushing resistance. The verdict came after 2 days of deliberation. Guilty on all counts. Florence was sentenced to 12 years without parole. Curtis got 8. After the sentencing, the judge made a rare statement from the bench. This court recognizes the courage of the residents who brought this to light. Without your vigilance, these crimes would have continued unchecked. Let this serve as a reminder that power granted without accountability is a danger to any community. Outside the courthouse, a few reporters tried to get a comment from Florence as she was led away. She said nothing, just stared ahead, jaw clenched, the same way she had that evening on my driveway when she realized I had caught her on camera. But the real closure didn't come from her vanishing behind a steel door. It came a week later, when we held a neighborhood gathering on the clubhouse lawn. There was no speech, no ceremony. Just lawn chairs, food trucks, and the sound of kids laughing as they ran between sprinklers. Arlo brought his harmonica. Mrs. Cardenas passed out homemade empanadas. Someone even set up a projector to play old movies on the side of the clubhouse. Fiona sat beside me in the grass, legs stretched out, sipping lemonade. The Jeep's new winch gleamed under the setting sun in the driveway behind us. "You ever think it would come to this?" she asked. "No," I said, "but I'm glad it did." She nudged my shoulder. "Still not painting the garage?" "Not a chance." We leaned back, watching as the sky turned amber and the first stars blinked into view. There were no more notices, no more threats, no more late-night chalk marks or hidden cameras. Just neighbors finally free of the shadow that had hung over us for far too long. And in the end, it wasn't just about paint. It never was. It was about standing your ground when it mattered, and proving that no one, not even a clipboard-wielding tyrant with a budget and a grudge, could own a community that was willing to fight back.